Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our October meeting for the Free Press Book Club. We're so happy to have you all here. We were just talking about how it's getting darker and darker every time we do a meeting, and now it's like fully pitch black out. So winter is on its way, I think. My name's Erin Labar. I am your book club admin. We'll just do our normal round of introductions before we get started. We have Ben Sigurdson, our literary editor at the Free Press. We have Chris Hall, the co-owner of McNally Robinson. And of course, our author, Patricia Robertson. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. Before we move on to our usual run of events, I just wanted to take a minute to do a land acknowledgement. We haven't been doing this as part of our book club meetings, and we should be, so we're going to start tonight. So I will say that we are on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and homeland of the Métis Nation. It's really important for us to be doing this. We have had tons of Indigenous authors. We've had Indigenous reporters. I'm sure we have Indigenous viewers. And we just want to make a point of making that land acknowledgement part of our regular meeting protocol. So we're going to continue that going forward. As for me, I'm going to stay on the call tonight. Things will run as usual, and then we'll talk a little bit about our November pick at the end of the meeting. So with that, I will throw to Chris, and he can do his introduction.
Fantastic. Thanks, Erin. So tonight we will be discussing a book of short stories, Hour of the Crab. Short stories are known in the book business as a hard sell, and in my experience, they live up to that reputation. It seems to me that they're perfect for our busy lifestyles. It's an opportunity to get through an entire story in those small corners of time we get to read. But I'm as guilty as anyone, get lured into the charms of that larger story in a novel. And yet every time I read a set of short stories, I wonder why I don't read more. Hour of the Crab had me thinking that again. The opening section of the book, also called Hour of the Crab, and it tempts us towards that larger story. The stories in it are linked by characters experiencing different aspects of a larger single story. The following stories are not linked so directly, and yet there are some similarities. Many of them have the presence of some difficult to define thing, a vision, a connection, a communication that inhabit the stories and affect the characters in various ways. In some stories, that thing is interpreted as a religious, but in others, it is left even more mysterious. And in that sense, I think the stories are still linked, but in other ways than directly through plot and characters. And there's no easy answers in these stories. Kate, in the opening story, is compelled to help find the family of the young man whose body she has found, and she's accused of only wanting to make herself feel better. It seems utterly hopeless that she can rid herself of the privileges that her race and her wealth give her in order to contribute something to these migrants' families. Her husband leaves her in frustration, and it's a frustration I have to admit I shared a little bit. And yet at the end of the story called The Gate of Charity, an elder in the village says that Kate has the vision, and it's a rare thing for a foreigner to see. So maybe things are not so hopeless after all, but they do remain very difficult to define. So that's what I've got to say to get us started, and I'll hand it over to Patricia Robertson, please, to read from Hour of the Crab.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that very observant introduction. I have to say that I think readers get a real bargain in short story collection, because they get 10 worlds or a dozen worlds in one book, as opposed to one world. The story I decided I would read from is called The Calligrapher's Daughter. And it's, I guess for me, it has a fable-like, almost a timeless tone, although it is in fact set in 16th century Fez in Morocco. And I'm going to read the opening section and then another short section. The Calligrapher's Daughter. It was the 4th day of Ramadan, and the calligrapher's daughter sat, as she always did, with her pens of sharpened reed, her inks of soot and copper sulfate bound with wine, her burnished paper. From the kitchen came her sister's chatter and the smell of harira, the dish that would break their fast that evening. As the youngest, she ought to be among them, chopping and stirring, measuring and tasting. but the calligrapher's daughter was exempt from such chores. From the age of 2, when she had traced with her finger the whorls and flourishes of her father's manuscripts, he had treated her as his apprentice. He taught her how to hold the pen, gave her scraps of paper on which to practice. Look, he had said then, she is in love, as I was. Her sisters muttered to each other about sorcery, enchantment, other dark spells. She is the pearl of my old age, their father answered. And when people said, Le Sual has what a misfortune, the calligrapher has only daughters, he replied, Allah, praise be unto him, has consoled me with a daughter with talent. At 7, the calligrapher's daughter was writing letters for her neighbors. At 12, she began transcribing her first Quran. At 14, she received her first commission, a suite of poems by the magnificent 14th century Grenadine poet Ibn al-Khatib, to be transcribed on gazelle's vellum and presented as a wedding gift from a Fez princeling to his bride. When not working, she spent hours in her father's library, which held a Quran that was said to have once belonged to the great Baghdad scholar Yaqub ibn Ashaq al-Kindi. Its pages were stained with salt and ocean spray, its binding frayed, but merely to hold it, or so the calligrapher's daughter believed, was to feel inspiration from the divine radiance flowing into one's fingers. Its anonymous creator, whoever she was, for the calligrapher's daughter was certain it was a woman, deserved, of course, no credit, as her father had long ago taught her. All credit belonged to Allah, who had sent the Quran to humankind as a talisman of the hidden book known only to the Lord of the worlds himself. For as the Quran said, if all the trees in the earth were pens, and if the sea eked out by 7 seas more were ink, the words of God could not be written out to the end. Now, on the 4th day of Ramadan, the calligrapher's daughter was beginning the most important commission she had ever undertaken, that of a Quran for the Sultan himself. It was to be a gift from the Grand Vizier of the court, to be presented 3 months hence on the 5th anniversary of the Sultan's victory over the Portuguese at the Battle of Qasr el-Kabir, when he had vanquished 500 ships and 18,000 men, with 9,000 dead and the rest taken prisoner. An almost impossible period of time in which to complete the work, yet it was difficult to concentrate with her stomach gurgling from hunger. The calligrapher's daughter picked up one of her pens, dipped it into the pot of powdered gold ink, and began drawing an arabesque within one of the shamsas, the little suns that illuminated the margins. While she worked, it was as though her father sat beside her, guiding her hand, murmuring instructions about the pressure of the pen, the angle of the nib, the purity of the letters. Handwriting, he had told her when she was still small, is jewelry by the hand from the pure gold of the intellect. It is also brocade woven by the reed pen with the thread of understanding. He himself was too old now to do the work. His hand shook, his sight had dimmed, but every day he came to inspect her own, to hold it up against the light that entered through the narrow window. Yes, daughter, here on this page you have achieved perfection, he would say. The perfection, that is, that Allah allows us to claim, although all our work is imperfect compared to his. Sometimes he took a pen and deliberately marred one of the still wet letters, making her cry out. She couldn't help it. Perfection is for Allah only, he always said. Let us remain humble by never forgetting. Handwriting may be jewelry and brocade, her sister Saida said, but when the time comes, I want my wedding dress woven of real silk, not words, even if they are from the Quran. A statement that had scandalized everyone else, though the calligrapher's daughter merely smiled. Wedding dresses, no matter how finely woven, fell apart, but the words of the Quran lasted forever. On the 19th day of Ramadan, after sunset, the Grand Vizier himself paid a call. His arrival sent all the women into a frenzy of preparation. Tea must be made and served in the ornate pot kept for special guests, sweetmeats chosen and set out on a tray, the vizier's horse stabled, his servants given something to eat. The calligrapher's daughter heard all the commotion outside, but paid no attention. She had long ago learned to resist the temptation of the streets. She continued working steadily even when the Grand Vizier entered the room, accompanied by her father, leaning on his staff. No, no, the Grand Vizier said as her father, scandalized, urged her to cover her face and rise. I see she is hard at work and the deadline is short. He bent over the table and scrutinized the page she was working on, where the heading of Surah 68, the pen, was enclosed in a glowing rectangle of gold, crimson, and blue. Magnificent, he murmured. Truly you are guided by the hand of Allah, as Zaid ibn Thabit himself must have been. There was no greater compliment than to be compared to the scribe of the Prophet. The calligrapher's daughter bowed her head as her father said, Really, Your Honor, you are too kind, much too kind. My daughter is young still. She has not come into her full powers. Then she will astound the world when she does, the Grand Vizier said sharply and turned on his heel. At the door, he said, An extra 100 gold benduki if you can complete it a week early. I should like to have it displayed at the palace for all to see. An extra 100 benduki, her father muttered after the Vizier was gone. The man cannot be a true Muslim to speak so. Perhaps he is a convert. The calligrapher's daughter said nothing, but a quiet pride filled her. She must be careful, she knew, not to let such praise go to her head. Still, it was gratifying to receive such approval when she was still young enough to savor the sweetness. Her father had been well into middle age before receiving his rightful due for his skills. What a shame, one of her sisters had said then, that Allah sends almonds to those without teeth.
What a great selection to read, Patricia. That was just beautiful and beautifully read. I just like, you have just such a command over these stories that it's fantastic. So thank you very much for that. The one thing, and in particular, I think in this story in particular that does jump out so much to me is the richness and detail that you're able to take the reader into in such short pieces, relative to, a novel where you can sort of stretch things out and really sort of dive in or whatever. But with these stories, I just felt with every one of them, I was just immersed immediately in the world that they took place in. So many of which, did feel relatively timeless, including this one. So just, I don't know, that's not a question. It's just a ramble. It's just rambling praise, I guess. So I know that these stories were written over the course of many years, and I think from
about a decade, I would say.
Yeah, and then compiled into this book. But and so, tell me a little bit about the process, or tell us a little bit about the process of pulling them together specifically for this collection, and also sort of, arranging them under these three themes or suites, if you will. What was that process like for you?
Well, it wasn't very conscious. I think the first story I wrote was the title story, Hour of the Crab. But I knew at some point it would end up in a collection, but I certainly didn't have any overarching vision. My characters come along and announce themselves to me, and I think, oh God, well, I don't know anything about that, so I guess I'm going to have to go and do some research. So yes, and when I had finished with, I lived in Spain for 3 years and still follow the news there. And of course, it's impossible to miss the stories of all these tens of thousands of migrants traveling to Europe through Africa or the Middle East or wherever. And that idea of a young Canadian woman on a belated honeymoon, actually, in southern Spain, and suddenly faced with a corpse, just kind of haunted me. And so I had to write the story. And when it was done, I thought it was still haunting me. I realized I wasn't quite finished. So I wrote another story, and then I think the third, and then had the idea of a quartet that would fit together, and they're all, of course, from different points of view. But as you said, these people are all connected around that theme of undocumented migration and how all these people interact with them.
Yeah, I mean, we had a reader question about what inspired the title story. So obviously the migrant experience, it sounds like,
Yes.
and your experience living there and sort of, hearing about it in much closer detail. I found it really interesting how, and Chris sort of touched on this in his introduction too, about Kate's motives and her, how we sort of, at first it seems like a very valiant effort that she's going through to sort of find this boy's family. But then, you start sort of questioning whether it's just this privileged white Western perspective needing to sort of, minimize their own guilt or whatever. And then, we sort of do this sort of, we sort of work around it and then end up in Lala's story where we see it from a totally different perspective, which, in some ways sort of amps that up and in some ways adds some more perspective. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how the four stories work in terms of, exploring that migrant experience and what it's like from a, Western perspective to sort of look at that subject matter, I guess?
Yeah, I had a similar feeling about Kate. I think initially I thought she was really admirable as I was writing her. But as she goes along, she becomes really, it's hard to live with a saint, right? It's hard to live with someone who's just, I'm giving up my whole honeymoon, in essence. And yes, I'm going to Morocco. And no, I won't necessarily be flying home with you if I haven't found the boy's family. And I've had readers say that they have real mixed feelings about Kate. And I certainly think she's very naive. This is really her first encounter with suffering, maybe, with people who are being regularly rejected as we speak by the developed world. I just wanted to toss in an actual true story that I came across while I was researching. It wasn't the impetus for my story, but I read of a young Spanish couple, both teachers, who found 27 corpses on a beach. And they turned out to be all young Moroccan men, and eventually nearly all from one village. So they did actually manage to track these corpses. And what they did was set up an NGO, and they had built a school in the village, and they bought goats for the villagers. And since they did that, not one single young man has left that village. So the reasons are so clearly economic and the climate crisis as well. And, that's where the so-called developed world should be putting its attention. Mm-hmm. It's an issue I feel very passionate about. And my social justice concerns probably come through in the collection, although hopefully not didactically.
No, I was just going to say, the issues around the migrant experience and particularly around climate change as well do definitely come through in some of these stories. But it's never in a way that's overly sort of heavy-handed or anything like that. Like it fits so naturally with the cadence of the stories and stuff. Chris, you look like you were about
Yeah, I was struck by I ended up thinking about almost two levels of storytelling. That you've got the news kind of level of what's going on with migrants, where you get the big picture, you get the big numbers, and then you get Kate seeing a dead body and the specificity of a story of an individual experience she finds that overwhelming more so than the overall story. And I wondered, as you worked your way through that book, how you brought that, or how you manage that tension, I guess, because if you gave in either direction, you would kind of lose you lose the power of the story almost.
I take my rants out on my husband, who doesn't appreciate it. I don't like didactic fiction myself. I don't like fiction where I feel I'm being hammered over the head by any aspect of the meaning of the story. I very much write with the idea that I want the reader to participate. I want the reader drawn into the story and coming to their own conclusions. And it's interesting what you said, Ben, about Lala providing the young Moroccan woman who Kate meets and stays with, actually, and how angry Lala is. Far from being, we might think, oh my God, here's this lovely white woman coming. No, she sees it very much in terms of the privilege. And so I think in the end, it's a tremendous learning experience for Kate that, you know, here she's confronted with her status in the world, perhaps for the first time. And having lived and traveled in poorer countries, in Spain, when I lived there, it was much poorer than it is now. It's I don't know what the word is. It's mind-blowing to be confronted by that and to realize how uneven, how unequal the world is. And there's Lala, of course, who's lost her older brother probably to death in the Mediterranean, like the boy Kate finds, and but is supporting her family. She's not able to go off and look for her brother, and suspects her younger brothers will head off the same way, with very little choice. If there's nothing else in your village, what are you going to do, right? See, I'm getting into a rant here.
No, not at all.
But then there's the moment with I think it's Lala's grandfather, the elder anyway, who points out that she has the vision, and I took that almost like she has the compassion, or she has the imagination almost of figuring out that these are individuals with individual stories and not just statistics, I guess. So I thought that was a really nice touch to add that, because suddenly for me, Kate suddenly came back to life.
Yes. Suddenly someone sees this as a gift she has, or a curse maybe, that has this compassion. And I agree. I think fiction, we get numbed by the statistics in the news, but when in stories, when we read stories of individual migrants and fictional stories, all of a sudden we remember these are people. These are flesh and blood people just like us, who happen to have the misfortune of being born in wherever is suffering at the moment.
I thought it was such an interesting component to bring in this sort of ghost or spirit of the boy to sort of interact with Kate, and I loved how it sort of there were similar aspects, like there's Thomas with the pickaxe. I can't remember the name of the story off the top of my head, but and there's the symbols on the skin and what have you. It was just like this beautiful sort of mysticism and this sort of spiritualism to the story, that I think really does sort of nuance the issues that you want to deal with, the migrant experience and climate change and all of those kind of things. Can you sort of talk a little bit about maybe incorporating those kind of elements into your fiction? Sometimes they're rooted in religion, sometimes they're sort of just spirits, presences, whatever, and just sort of how what that experience is like for you writing that stuff, that kind of stuff.
I guess I feel there are multiple dimensions to our lives as humans, and mysterious dimensions that we don't always have the language to speak about, and I don't find that enough in realism. I have a real problem with just realism, because I don't think it's very real, and given the world we're now living in, which feels like a bad science fiction novel to most of us, it's not real anymore. It's only, to me, realism is reflecting where we are. There's an American writer called Theodora Goss who says that's why she writes fantasy, because fantasy is the new reality. And that's basically how. Now, I'm not writing, one might say, full-blown fantasy. I like fiction that has one foot in the real world and one foot somewhere else. But I really feel those dimensions. Perhaps it's that I part of me is very uncomfortable in our reductive, highly materialist world, and I don't mean just materialistic, but we're so focused on what we can tangibly see and touch and so on. And we have really, capitalism, neoliberalism doesn't make much room for mysticism, not profitable. But it's there in everybody's life, and the dimensions of love and empathy and compassion and so on are part of what make us human.
Yeah.
Something in it almost needs to be undefined the way you leave it, though, because there's lots of people who would take a spiritualism and preach it or sell it. And so what I was struck by is even the firefighters have a sixth sense. That's how they survive through the fire. So it's not something to be named and defined and then held. I ended up calling it a thing because I couldn't come up with another word. I put it in quotation marks, but like, do you have a word for what you're playing with there, or just?
I don't. I'm going to. Well, I like to call my fiction hyperrealism, but I don't have a word for what you're. As you were talking, I thought, yeah, athletes talk about being in the zone, right, when they're really performing, and artists have similar experiences. But again, what do we call that? You know, it's a nameless dimension, and we can't see it, and we can't touch it, and we can't commodify it. Thank God.
Yeah,
and I mean, so almost belittles it.
Yeah.
To name it almost reduces it.
Yes.
Well, you know, like there was a couple stories, including fire breathing, where, you know, I thought, oh, you know, this is sort of, it's got a sort of dystopian element to it. But then, you know, when you sort of dig into it, you're like, is it really dystopian? Is it really that far off from where we are right now? And, you know, and so that for me was a real eye opener, especially, you know, every year the wildfires, you know, on the West Coast get worse and worse. And, you know, it's not, you know, it's like what, 32 above in January or whatever it is in the story. And, you know, you think, oh, that's wild. That's so far away, but it's really not that far away.
California has a year-round fire season now. It's coming north.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that story is 20 years in the future. I'm not even sure it's going to take us 20 years to get there, you know.
No, and British Columbia, I mean, the Okanagan Valley, I mean, I write about wine and drinks and stuff like that. So in the Okanagan Valley, the wildfires and throughout Napa and Sonoma and stuff like that too, every year they just keep getting worse. And I was out there talking to winemakers, and they're like, it's not an unusual thing anymore. This is the norm now. Like, we have to wonder about, you know, how close the fires are going to get to our properties and stuff. Anyway, that's sort of for another book or another Zoom session. But it's true, it's not that far off. And in addition to, you know, sort of not the coups, but the, you know, the struggles for power in, you know, in one of the earlier stories. I think is it Happiness, or is it the Gate of Charity? I can't remember. Anyway, where, you know, it's like, you know, governments are being, you know, deposed or taken over, or people are being hauled off to prison and stuff like that.
That's not the one with the grandson. The last story in that. Yes, that's it's right. Called the Oodmaker's Son.
That's right, the Oodmaker's Son. Yes, that's not dystopian anymore. That's, you know, that's real life. Yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've actually got very tired of dystopic fiction. I mean, can we not imagine some other kind of, things are terrible, but in the midst of that, to take one example, Ty, the firefighter, is discovering a relationship with trees.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Who are beginning to talk to him. And, you know, terrible and demanding as his job is, it's almost as though, and I really do believe this, it's in crisis that we are broken open. It's only in crisis that we are going to, you know, really come to terms. Because I think we're all in total denial, actually, as Greta Thunberg tells us. And I think, wouldn't that be amazing if out of all this came some different relationship with the natural world, you know? So, which is not to say that I plan that. I mean, these things come to me in the store, and it's like, oh no, you know. But
well, okay. So I have a sort of a question related to that. You know, in a recent interview, you mentioned you don't really know what's going to happen when you set out writing a story, that it's a journey. Like in the story of Fire Breathing, at one point does the story say to you, these trees are going to talk to this firefighter? I don't know how else to put it, sort of thing. Like, was that sort of always in your mind as you sort of set out writing the story, or was it just sort of like, it's going to be a climate, you know, it's going to be a wildfire story, and then suddenly the trees just start talking?
Yeah, it's very much sentence by sentence. In fact, that's the name of a writing workshop I'm going to be doing at the end of the month through Thin Air Festival. I don't know. I may have a very vague idea where the story is going, but to be honest, if I knew where it was going and where it ended, I wouldn't write it. I'm writing it for me as a journey, as a story. And as someone said, writing is like being in a dark cave and lighting matches that keep going out. and you're really flying blind a lot of the time. And sometimes the story veers off and you realize that, and you go back the next day or on a later draft and realize, you know, it's not working, but that's just the nature of the creative process. It's kind of messy and non-linear, and yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amazing.
But it's also part of the great joy of it to encounter these characters who, as Anne Lamott says, can't type, so I have to write the story for them. And I consider it a great privilege. I get to lead all these other lives that I would never have access to in real life.
That's fantastic. Erin, you want anything you want to add?
Yeah, I have a question that's more
reader questions or anything like that.
I have a question from me that's more about like the process and less about the content. So people might know that I used to do the music reporting at the paper. And one of the questions that I would talk to, well, I love short stories, first of all, or collections, because they remind me of albums. So each story is like a song and it's its own little world and it's got its flow. And then they're all come together to make something cohesive. So one thing that we used to talk about all the time with musicians was the sequencing and sort of how they decided which songs go in what spot, openers, closers, and how that kind of affects the overall impact of the album. So I'm curious if you go through a process like that where you think really hard about which stories you want to put where, and if so, like what that process is like for you.
Yes, I do. And I decided eventually with this book that I wanted to start with what you might call the most realistic stories and move towards the kind of more fable. Like my editor actually suggested we turn it around. And I thought about that and thought, no, I think I want to start with that sequence of 4. But it would be like putting together an album. You're having to make judgment calls on what the order, and you might look back and think, oh, I wish I'd done it the other way around, or but it's what it is. It's done. Yeah.
You just have to wait for the remix album.
Yeah.
I will.
Well, we do have like some of the reader questions that we got did talk a little bit more about the sort of nuts and bolts of short fiction and the book in particular. Marguerite was wondering if there was one of the short stories in your book that had the biggest effect on you and why.
On me. Oh. I think the thing I end up falling in love with all my characters when I'm working on the story, even the ones who are not very likable, and you have to do that or you end up judging them. So when I'm working on a story that's my favorite story, I don't know, looking back now, if I could say one had more effect on me than the other. That's a very interesting question, but I think maybe I have a particular soft spot for the 4-story sequence at the beginning, just because it's a more expansive world. There's a number of characters involved. I've had a number of people women tell me how much they like Enrique, the police officer. And one of my American friends, who's a writer, said that. And I said, well, why? Why did you like him? She said, well, he seems like a decent man, unlike the thugs in my country.
Well, that's good. That's a great answer. Okay, so Shirley asked, what was the hardest of the stories to write in the book?
It's a bit like childbirth. I've forgotten all the date now.
Although the child, you could say which child was the hardest to birth, and probably you could just come up with an answer.
I'm trying to think if there's one story that got rewritten more than any of the others. I certainly have other stories that I didn't include, stories that I feel not ready, not working. And I was interested to read some years ago that Alice Munro says she doesn't publish about 20% of what she writes. So, and that's always disheartening when you feel, what, this story isn't working and may never work, and I just have to move on. So I can't say now. And the truth, of course, is that the book came out this year, but I had worked on it for a decade before that, and I'm now into a novel. And so it's a little hard to go back to that world and kind of remember what it was like.
Sure. Well, that's interesting that because you've not published a novel before, have you?
I've self-published a novel, but not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes, a juvenile fantasy novel back when I was getting really fed up with realistic fiction and was kind of felt I couldn't talk about these kinds of questions, or hadn't found a way yet to do that.
Well, what I was going to say is that I've talked to authors before who have said, oh yeah, I started a novel, I got 200 pages in, and then I had to put it away. So I mean, at least in writing short fiction,
Yes.
the story, it's like 15, 20 pages, and you put it away. That's less of your life that you've sort of expended on writing that. So.
And I've lived the other version too. The novel I spent 7 years on the abandoned. So, yeah.
It's in that drawer in your desk or whatever, as they are, as often described.
I think I threw it out, actually. I don't want anybody to find it after I'm dead. Oh my God, she was losing it clearly.
Chris?
That's the we were talking about Kate and her privilege and so on. I feel like as readers we're really privileged, because you're saying you worked on these stories over 10 years and it's such a messy process, and yet we just get the final product. And for me, I'm surprised to hear that it took 10 years, because they have this kind of consistency to them. Like I just read it like this was a kind of a, I don't know, a single project. And like I'm assuming you didn't rework the stories to kind of fit them together. So this is just kind of a consistency of your voice and what you've developed over all that work.
I think so. I think there is that voice now that I feel I've developed, and it's taken much of my writing life to do that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think writers are in charge exactly of their voices. They don't get to pick their styles. It's something that emerges gradually over time as you develop the skills. Mm-hmm.
Right, and part of the sacrifice is, I guess, is all those thrown out pages, right?
Well, I tell my students, when we go to the ballet, the last thing we want to see is the bloody toe shoes. We want the fantasy, right? The drifting across it, So we don't really care how many drafts it will take to do your story. We just want the story to work. So don't whine to me about how hard work it is.
Well, I'm grateful, I have to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I had something I was going to add to that too, and it was now I totally lost it.
I can jump back in, because I wanted to talk about the title of the. It's not just the title of the book; it's the title of a section and the title of a story. And yet, the moment of the crab in the title story, unless I got it wrong, is the image of the crab, the tiny crab scattered from the right ear, and disappeared into the sand. That's the image, is it?
That's the image. Good for you. Yes, because a lot of people.
It's in some ways a tiny, tiny image, and yet you've loaded it with meaning by using it. What's that image mean to you that allowed it to carry such weight?
Well, images turn up in stories and you don't understand them at the time. It's always after the fact. But looking at it now, crabs are scavengers. So they're living off a lot of human beings in the Mediterranean, I guess it was sort of an image of a world where human beings are not worth very much, being cast aside. And it's interesting, though, because my sister had a whole other explanation for the story involving astrology and cancer, crab cancer, and so on, which had never occurred to me. But I think, I think stories, novels, whatever that are working are larger than the writer. And that it allows many possibilities, because as readers, we all bring our own selves, our own experiences, our own lives, our own previous reading, and so we're naturally going to layer it in, all in different ways. There's such a thing as misreading, but I think the stories I love are the ones which are, every time I go back, I see something, another layer peels away, or I see something new that I hadn't seen before.
And that ties in perfectly to the question that I just remembered, and I wrote down a quick little keyword as you were talking. One thing I found about these stories, Patricia, is that unlike I think back to my second year English courses, where you read a short fiction anthology, and a lot of these stories just wrapped up really neatly. Like it sort of it came to this conclusion, and it just the ending just was very neat and tidy, and it just closed things off or whatever. Whereas with these stories, I found it's a little bit more open to interpretation. There's a little bit more of an open-endedness to them, and I really love that. I thought I thought it would be worth asking sort of about whether that is something that is in your mind as you're writing, or if it's just you sort of get to a point and it feels done, or if there's something else at play there entirely.
Yeah, it does get to a point where it feels done, although W.H. Auden said that a poem was not so much finished as abandoned. And I think any artist gets to a point where you think, okay, I've just given it my all. If I do any more, I'm going to spoil it. But I don't like tied with a bow endings. And one of my mentors was the late Canadian poet Don Coles, who ended up writing a novel himself, but primarily wrote poetry. And we were working on one of my much earlier stories in an earlier collection. He said, I think you should end this story just on a breath. And I'd written a longer ending, and I looked at it again and changed the ending and realized, that it was a bit of a startling ending, actually, the way he was suggesting. But again, life doesn't have neat tied bow endings either. And I want the fiction to kind of bleed out into to linger with the reader, because the reader's going to go, okay, what happens? What happens when Kate goes home? Does she go home to her husband? Do they stay together? Do they,
Mm-hmm.
Audrey Thomas has this wonderful fantasy that when she goes to heaven, she will meet all her characters, and she will say, Mrs. Smith, what happened after Jimmy got out of jail? Did he go straight after? Which I think is the most wonderful fantasy, and where you just meet. You don't have to write the story anymore. You're just meeting the actual characters, right? So that's what I plan to do, is to ask them all what they.
I love that. I love that.
But you're also getting into what you don't like about realism, right? It's not realistic to have tidy endings. It's not realistic to have unmessy lives. It's not realistic to have everything mean something specific. So I agree with you. I much prefer. I'm a little bit skeptical about what realism actually is.
Mm-hmm.
Very.
We can all agree on that.
Sorry, that wasn't a question.
That's fine. That's how I usually conduct most of these about things. I just say some weird statement, and then I realize it's not a question, and then there's an awkward silence, and we just carry on. But I will jump back to a reader question from Heather to sort of circle back around to Calligrapher's Daughter. She says the nameless Calligrapher's Daughter represents, I guess this is in her opinion, imprisonment of women on so many levels. Can you comment on how the exile of women in professions, in abuse situations, and patriarchal societies influence the story and your writing in general? So just a small question.
Well, I would certainly agree with all of that politically. It's not present in my mind when I'm writing a story. And in fact, I'm not sure I see the Calligrapher's Daughter as totally, given that in her society, her talent is highly valued. Yes, she is imprisoned later by the Sultan, who is clearly a mercurial and all-powerful man and has many male prisoners as well as her. I guess I grew very interested in Spanish history, which is also Arabic history, when I lived in Spain, because the Arabs ruled Spain for 700 years. And that got me into reading about Islam and the history of Arabic rule. And then led into, I think the Arabic language is so beautiful in its written form. And then that led me into calligraphy. And lo and behold, a nameless, as characters in fables usually are nameless, which is why she's just called the Calligrapher's Daughter. But it's also clearly a highly valued role. And there were in fact women calligraphers, not all of them probably known by name, but they did exist in those earlier times. I'm not sure I answered the question, but I focused on the story.
I think it was a great, you took a great swing at it. So, and I love that at the end of this story as well, too, it's left open-ended, sort of similar to what I was mentioning earlier, where, it's not known whether her request to, to go home and write from there is granted, but it is known that she continued to write do this incredible calligraphy or whatever for years to come or whatever. So I thought that was just like a nice example of that. That's not a question either. See, I did it again.
Well, I think we're probably going to wrap up relatively soon. I know this is like flown by so fast.
Yeah.
I'm going to steal Ben's usual last question and ask, you mentioned that you're writing a novel. Do you want to, is there anything that you can talk about with that, or any other projects that you're working on right now that you want to share anything about?
Well, the novel is very different in some ways. It's set in a future, and it will sound dystopic when I describe it. It's about a group of sort of semi-feral children and adolescents living in an unnamed area of northern Canada.
Sounds like what's sort of going on downstairs in my house.
based on the Yukon, but really the focus is not on how they survive. The focus is on their relationship with the natural world, and how one of the children in particular, who is kind of a visionary, pushes the need for that. And I originally wrote the first half as a novella. Couldn't get that published, although I had an agent really interested in it. But Canada's a very risk-averse market. So
if short stories are tough to sell, novellas are even harder.
But the UK, will publish novellas, but there's a bigger, I understand there's a bigger market there. And so now I realized there was a whole opportunity for a second half, because the first half actually refers to future events. So that's what I'm writing now. And the novel is called How to Talk to a Glacier.
That's, what the most amazing thing about this answer is that you answered it all, because usually if I ask that question, people are like, well, I don't want to jinx it. I don't really want to talk about it yet. It might not happen, but you're so earnest and confident in it. I love it.
Well, I'm fairly far into it at this point.
Okay.
The first half of it was written, again, close to a decade ago. So it feels a little more, I'm not at the stage where I'm feeling the superstition of, oh my God, it'll vanish in the morning if I.
Well, that's good. And then
maybe we'll get Erin to ask the question from now on, Ben.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, that's good. Maybe
she'll ask the novel, what are you working on question.
Maybe I'm just not asking the question the right way. And so one thing before we sort of wrap up or whatever, I'm just wondering, like, there must be just so, like, it just feels like there was so much research that goes into these stories in terms of getting the historical facts right and stuff, even when it's not like there's not a real sort of concrete notion of when these stories are taking place. They're just taking place in so many different corners of the world, in so many different cultures, with so many different characters that but everything just feels so, like the world building is just so complete or whatever. So have you found writing this novel, the research process has been as intensive, or is it sort of set in a way or a place or a time where you have a little bit more flexibility with those kind of things?
I think it's been a little less intensive, partly because it's set in unnamed, but set in or based on the Yukon, where I lived for 20 years. So yes, and again, I'm not researching 10 different worlds. I'm in one. Well, actually, the first half of the novel, the second half takes place 16 years after the first. But I mean, we're still in the same location, and so apart from the fact the climate crisis is worse. And the characters are older, it's not in other ways requiring a whole different level of research. But I love doing research, and it's very dangerous, because you find all these wonderful details that you really want to stick in, and you really have to tell yourself, as Hemingway did, kill all your darlings. It doesn't fit the story. I tell my students to open a separate file in which they put all their darlings. The truth is you never use them, but at least they're there if you ever find a place for them.
Exactly. I mean, and I think that's I mean, I love that you love to do research, and it shows in your book, obviously, like the attention to detail, and it's so interesting talking to someone based in Winnipeg. I know you've lived in BC and in the Yukon, and you were born in the UK, but with a lot of Winnipeg or capital P prairie writers, so much of the writing tends to focus and gravitate around this place. So, to be able to travel to these different times and places and worlds and stuff like that is just such a joy. And I thank you so much, Patricia, for taking the time to talk to us. And I'm going to throw it back to Erin now, who is she's over here on my screen. So.
Yes, thank you so much, Patricia, for your time and for your work. As I said, I love short fiction, so I just love this collection. So our next month's pick, Status Update by George Tolles and illustrated by Cliff. Is it Eland or Island? Eland? Okay. Eland. So this is microfiction. If you thought short stories were short, these are like tiny. I did this on purpose because I thought it'd be really interesting to go from like a novel to short fiction and then to microfiction to kind of, I don't know. I love how much can be done in a few sentences. So I'm really excited.
Next month's book is going to be even shorter.
Yeah, it's just going to be non-existent. We're just not even going to do book club.
Well, you'll have to poetry next, I think.
Yeah, book of poetry. There you go. Yeah.
You know what? Want to challenge us, Aaron.
Book of poetry is a great idea, and I'm going to write down a couple ideas as soon as we're off this call.
Okay, do that. But yeah, I'm super excited for everyone to dig into this. These are literal status updates that George Tolles posted. He still posts on his Facebook page, and Cliff illustrated them. It's also one of our first, or I think maybe our only book that's had illustrations. I think maybe Treat had some illustrations, but this is like a brand new wheelhouse for us, and I'm really excited for everyone to dig into that for next month.
Well, I can give a quick preview because when I did my MA in English at U of M, I took a film studies course with George, and he is you could just listen to him talk all night.
I know
he's not the most concise individual all the time, but he just like the cadence of his voice and the knowledge that he brings is just, I love it.
I know, I gotta come clean too. I took probably 2 or 3 film courses with George as well when I was at
university.
Did you? Yeah, film studies minor over here. So I'm really excited to have him and talk about this book. It's going to be really interesting, I hope. Otherwise, I think that's it for us tonight. We will see you again next month. All of our upcoming picks are on our website, so you can look there. You'll get an email tomorrow with more information on everything. And thank you again, Patricia, for being here. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Chris. And we'll see you next month.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It was great to chat. Thanks,
Patricia, so much. It was fantastic.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.